People have had plenty of time to get here. So, your first homework, getting started on WebAssign, is due on Friday. I pushed the first couple homeworks back a bit so you can get used to the system and get things in. In general, they'll be closer to the quizzes in the future. The chapter 1 homework will be due on Thursday, the 29th. That's a week from today. Both of them are on WebAssign. If you have any past due assignments, if you have anything you need to finish up, you can request an extension. There's an automatic extent. I would suggest choosing automatic extensions. I can't demonstrate that yet because there aren't any past due assignments. The chapter 1 quiz will be today in SI. You get one sheet of notes for reference. So if there's things you're having trouble remembering, like possibly the metric prefixes, you might want to record those down on your sheet of notes. Conversion factors will be included, but you do need to know the metric prefixes. If I remember correctly. David actually wrote this quiz, so it's not at the top of my head. But yes, so, but you get one, that's just general policy for all quizzes and tests. You get one sheet of notes for reference. I use that policy in all of my classes. So any questions about the homework, the quiz, anything like that? Quiz will be mostly multiple choice questions. Yeah. It's material we've already covered from chapter 1. So it's the chapter 1 material, which we've already covered. So the review we did, name? At the end of chapter 1 would be the appropriate sort of material to look at. And I believe David handed out a packet of reference material as well. So no, I will just be continuing chapter 21. So let's talk about body waves. We were talking about waves from earthquakes passing through the earth, and how we can use those to image the interior of the earth. This is very similar to what we do if you've ever had an ultrasound. Well, it's somewhat similar to what occurs with an ultrasound, where you send out waves and you receive those waves and create an image through that. So body waves within the earth, the velocity of them is dependent on the density of the material that they pass through in the interior of the earth. And it turns out when a wave, any wave, passes from one material where it travels at one velocity to a material where it travels at a different velocity, it will bend. That's true with light. That's true with waves, sound waves, and that's true with waves in the earthquake waves in the air. It's easiest to see with light. So if you've ever seen, that thing where the pen looks broken or bent because it's sitting in a glass of water, that's because the light is being bent when it exits the water. That's refraction. The Earth's interior generally increases in density with depth. This causes the waves to curve and refract. And geophysicists can use the travel velocity, the pattern of refraction, and the travel path to interpret our modern view of the Earth's interior structure. It's like figuring out the shape of some glass structure from the weird light pattern it puts on the wall. It's tricky, but it's doable. So we can use this to build up a model of the Earth's interior. There's also an additional bonus where S waves only travel through solids, while P waves will travel through solids and liquids. So we can identify that there's a portion of the interior of the Earth that is liquid, and that is that liquid inner core. So our understanding of the Earth's internal structure, there's a solid inner core, there's a liquid outer core, there is the mantle, and then there is the crust, the surface we live on. And if we look at S waves, which are stopped by liquid, there's this big area of the Earth that's in shadow from an earthquake. While P waves, there's a small area that's in shadow caused by refraction, but we do see P waves passing all the way through the core. And this gives us an idea of the Earth's interior. And I just realized I may not have set up the sound. Yeah. So this gives us an image of the Earth's interior and allows us to understand what's going on underground. This is a simplified drawing with these nice spherical things. The actual interior is not so smooth. There are big lumps and things that as we've gotten better at imaging the interior of the Earth, we've been able to discover more detail. The structure is not so neat and clean, but this is a good approximation of it. So here's a short video about that process of understanding waves in the Earth and how we image the interior of the Earth with seismic waves.
In this video, you're going to learn how we used earthquakes to look deep into the Earth. How deep is the deepest mine on Earth? Is it A, 1 kilometers, B, 2.5 kilometers, C, 4 kilometers, or D, 9 kilometers? It's 4 kilometers. How deep is the deepest hole ever drilled into the Earth? Is it A, 12 kilometers, B, 18 kilometers, C, 22 kilometers, or D, 28 kilometers? It's 12 kilometers. Were you close? The distance to the center of the Earth is about 6,400 kilometers, so the deepest hole is only about 0.2% of the way in. So how do we know so much about the structure of the Earth, since we have quite literally only scratched the surface? You may have seen cutaway diagrams of the Earth like this. So how do we know so much about somewhere we haven't yet been able to explore? We need to use something that will penetrate deep into the Earth and return information back to the surface. The Earth's surface is broken up into several tectonic plates, which are in constant, very slow motion. Earthquakes occur usually at the boundaries of these plates, as they move against each other. Watch our video on plate tectonics. Earthquakes create shock waves, like a bell ringing, known as seismic waves, and these travel both deep into the Earth and around its surface. Two types of seismic waves are made, and each is quite different. P waves. These waves travel the fastest and are called primary waves or pressure waves, as they arrive at a distant location first. These waves compress and stretch the rocks as they spread out. P waves pass easily through both solids like rock and liquids like magma. S waves. These slower waves arrive after the P waves, and so are called secondary waves or shear waves. S waves cause an up and down motion. They travel through solid but not liquid. Earthquakes are daily natural events monitored by seismic detector stations across the globe, which all build up a picture of how the waves travel through the Earth. This is one way of displaying the seismic waves as detected by a seismometer. Notice how the P waves arrives first. And here comes the S wave. It was found that not all of the waves started by an earthquake arrived at the seismic detectors on the other side of the Earth. P waves are detected over most, not all, of the surface of the Earth. The curved paths are caused by refraction of the P waves as they pass through rocks of different densities. Remember, P waves travel through both solid and liquid. The core dramatically alters the path of the waves as they approach or pass through it, which suggests a significant change in density from a solid into a liquid state, magma. This is how we explain the so-called P-wave shadow, and so begin to understand the structure of our Earth. S-waves have a much larger shadow zone, suggesting there is a liquid iron structure deep in the Earth they cannot travel through. Calculations can then be done to deduce the relative sizes of the layers hidden deep inside the Earth and suggest if they are liquid or solid. In conclusion, study of S and P waves led us to the knowledge that the Earth has a layered structure with a solid inner core surrounded by an outer liquid core.
So, in general, we think the Earth is composed of 4 concentric layers or zones. There's a few ways we can divide up the interior structure of the Earth. This is based on what material they're made of. So there's the most common divisions are the inner core, the outer core, the mantle, and the crust. The inner core is solid metal, iron and nickel. The outer core is liquid metal, iron and nickel. The mantle is dense rock. And the crust is a less dense rock. So the rock in the mantle and the rock in the crust have different properties. And there's different compositions of physical properties that characterize each of these layers. There are also some sort of layers based on whether they're rigid or flexible and such in the upper mantle and lower mantle. You can subdivide the mantle a bit as well, which we'll talk about a little later. So evidence suggests the inner core is solid and it's composed of about 85% iron and nickel. The rest is mostly nickel. It has a radius of around 1,230 kilometers. The outer core is assumed to have the same or similar composition as the inner core, but is a liquid because the pressure is lower. So the inner core is made solid by the high pressure. So as you go towards the center of the Earth, temperature and pressure increase, and that causes a transition from liquid to solid in the core. The thickness of the outer core is around 2,240 kilometers. While the mantle's composition is distinctly different. Instead of being primarily metal, iron and nickel, it's mostly rock. It's lots of silicates. The upper mantle, near the surface, below the crust, is nearly molten. Not quite, but close. It means it's sort of soft and can kind of ooze over very long periods of time. The lower mantle is more solid and rocky. And then there's a thin, solid outer layer that we live on. That's the crust. There's also a thin layer of the mantle beneath the crust that is also solid. Then there's sort of a soft layer beneath that the crust and that upper layer of the mantle slide on to allow the tectonic plates to move. And then as you go deeper, the pressure causes the rock of the mantle to become more solid. Yes. So here's a sort of summary of the interior structure of the Earth.
If we could split open our planet, we would see that it is made up of various zones. The Earth is approximately 8,000 miles or 13,000 kilometers in diameter, from the North Pole to the South Pole. At the center, we have what we call the inner core. It is thought to be a solid metal ball, about 750 miles or 1,200 kilometers thick. This center core is under extreme pressure and is believed to be at least 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 2,760 degrees Celsius. Surrounding the inner core is the outer core. This area is about 1,400 miles or 2,300 kilometers thick and is believed to be molten or liquid rock. Nickel and iron are probably the main elements of the outer core. Next is the mantle, approximately 1,800 miles or 2,900 kilometers thick. Geologists think that most of the mantle is solid rock. However, towards the top of this layer, there exists an area of hot, thick, molten rock. This area is called the asthenosphere. And above this area is the cool and rigid outer shell of the Earth, which we call the crust. Geologists sometimes refer to the crust and the solid area directly below it as the lithosphere. As we take a closer look at our diagram, we see that on dry land, the crust is a mere 20 to 60 miles or 30 to 100 kilometers thick. The rock that is similar to the common rock, granite, makes up most of this section of the crust. And under the ocean, the crust is a much thinner layer of rocky material similar to basalt. This section of the crust is approximately 3 to 6 miles or 5 to 10 kilometers thick.
So as in the previous video, they mentioned the deepest hole ever drilled was about 12 kilometers deep. It was in continental crust because it's in Russia. Actually, is it still in Russia? I mean, it was done by the USSR. So, but I think it's still in Russia actually. And interestingly, the reason it failed is because it got too hot. The problem was the drill bits kept melting, so they couldn't keep drilling. Like, you know, as they got deeper, it got hotter. Well, it got hotter and yeah, so basically it just destroyed drill bits at too fast of a rate, so they couldn't go any deeper. But yeah, it's like in the middle of the continent, so it's on relatively thick crust. So it never made it through. The equivalent American project to drill a really super deep hole, which was called the Mohole project, was underwater trying to go through oceanic crust. It also never made it through the crust. It was a lot less deep of a hole, if I remember correctly. We gave up a lot faster. Basically. Well, I mean, also there was a whole bunch of weird politics and stuff going on with it because it was one of those Cold War race to see who could do the most thing, but it was instead of, you know, something impressive like going to space, it was drilling a hole. There has been some talk about reviving these, but the interior structure of the Earth, there's a crust, which is 5 to 40 kilometers thick. It varies from around 0 to 500 degrees Celsius. Below that, there's the upper mantle, which is about 670 kilometers thick. That has a thin, rigid layer next to the crust, and then a softer layer beneath that, that the crust and the thin, rigid layer, that lithosphere that was mentioned in the video, slides on top of. Then there's the lower mantle, which is about 2,230 kilometers thick, and it goes from about 1,000 to 400 degrees Celsius. The upper mantle goes from around 500 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Then we get the outer core, which is a viscous metallic liquid, which is all about 2,240 kilometers thick and around 4,000 degrees Celsius. The outer core is actually very important to us for people who live on Earth, because currents in the outer core are what actually create the magnetic field of the Earth. which protects us from the solar wind and stuff being emitted by the sun. Charged particles coming from the sun, it traps them and moves them out of the way. And without that, though, that could strip away our atmosphere and things like that. So having a magnetic field implies that you have some sort of liquid core. And then the inner core is thought to be a solid iron ball, basically with a radius of about 1,230 kilometers. And it's at around 6,000 degrees Celsius. So the Earth's crust, the outermost layer that we live on, is by far the thinnest. It ranges from about 5 to 11 kilometers for oceanic crust. That's the crust under the ocean. And about 19 to 40 kilometers for continental crust. That's the crust that forms the continents. Oceanic crust is composed mostly of basalt, which is denser rock. So the oceanic crust is thinner and denser. The continental crust is less dense and thicker, which means when oceanic crust runs into continental crust, the oceanic crust being thinner and denser is the one that sinks underneath the continental crust. And there's a sharp boundary in composition between the base of the crust and the upper mantle. Not in physical properties, they're both solid, but the composition changes. The upper mantle is made of different types of rock than the crust. And this boundary is called the Mohorovic discontinuity, or simply MOHO. So that is the boundary between the upper layer of the mantle and the bottom of the crust is the Mohorovic discontinuity, or MOHO. Now, the crust and the upper mantle can be divided a little bit differently if we take into account the physical properties and behavior. So if we look at the physical properties, the crust and the very top part of the upper mantle are solid and brittle, rigid and brittle. And that is the lithosphere, this rigid, brittle layer. This is the entire crust and the uppermost part of the mantle. This is where most faults and earthquakes occur. Tectonic plates are plates of lithosphere. And this extends, the lithosphere extends down to about 70 kilometers. It's thinner under the oceans, and it's thickest where there are tall mountains. Because when mountains go up, the lithosphere also actually goes down as well below. Because the lithosphere is basically floating on top of the more plastic and mobile layer underneath it, the asthenosphere. The asthenosphere lies below the crust. It extends down about 700 kilometers, and it's hot, but not under so much pressure that it's forced to be solid. So it's gooier. It's not quite liquid, but it's almost liquid. So it's plastic. It's easy to deform. It can move, and it's essential for the motion of tectonic plates. Movement of the asthenosphere by heat currents driven by temperature currents and convection is what moves tectonic plates. So all the energy for earthquakes and volcanoes and all that comes from heat within the earth, and that is driven by movement of the asthenosphere, mostly. Yeah. So the lithosphere is solid, and it slowly moves over the top of the plastic, deformable asthenosphere. So there's a sharp Mohorovic discontinuity between the crust and the upper mantle. And then there's a layer of upper mantle that is solid, that's the lithosphere. And then there's a softer layer underneath, that's the asthenosphere. And you have the crust can be continental crust, which you can see is thicker, or oceanic crust, which is thinner. And you can see where mountains go up, the bottom of the lithosphere and the bottom of the crust also dips down. Because basically this is floating on top of the asthenosphere, So the weight of this tall mountain basically pushes down the bottom of the lithosphere. And we'll talk about that a bit later. If you look at so how did people figure out that we're living on continents that are moving and rearranging themselves over time? Well, the first thing was that if you look at a map of the world, one of the first indicators is that if you look at the borders of Africa and South America, they basically fit into each other. And they fit together very well. And this becomes even clearer if you include what's called the continental shelf, which is sort of the shallow portion of the ocean extending out from the edge of continents. And so you could ask yourself, is this a coincidence, or were these two and other continents also at one point attached? So over the past several hundred years, scientists have speculated as to the meaning of this observation and asked the fundamental question, have the continents moved? Have the continents drifted? So the first person to put together a solid theory of continental drift with evidence supporting it, like solid, good evidence supporting it, was Alfred Wegener. So Alfred Wegener lived from 1880 to 1930. He was a German meteorologist and geophysicist. And in the early 1900s, he revived and proposed this hypothesis of continental drift, but was able to actually find some serious evidence supporting it. So Wegener proposed that around 200 million years ago, all the continents were together in a supercontinent he called Pangaea, which just means all land in Greek. And during the past 200 million years ago, Pangaea broke apart and the newly formed continents slowly drifted apart. And not only did he take the shapes of the continents into account, how they fit together kind of like puzzle pieces, he also found evidence of similar animals on continents separated by an ocean, fossils that matched across where the continents would connect, and other evidence like this. It probably helped that he spent a surprising amount of time in doing meteorology in the Arctic, so he had a lot of time to sit around and think. But here is a short video about that, process of the continents drifting apart from Pangaea.
Continental drift.
This is our modern understanding of how Pangaea broke apart.
Let's travel back in time and watch continents move. Moving back in time, the Himalayas and Mount Everest disappear as the collision between India and Asia is reversed. Climates are changing. Australia joins Antarctica as India approaches. Going back 150 million years, the continents are joined in three large pieces. South America and Africa are on one landmass. India, Australia, and Antarctica form a second. North America, Europe, and Asia make a third. 225 million years ago, the supercontinent Pangaea exists. Let's watch this movement as it occurred going forward in time. As Pangaea splits into three large pieces, the Atlantic Ocean starts to form. India starts its race to collide with Asia. As the continents take their current locations, India and Asia collide, and the Himalayas and Mount Everest appear. What is next?
So around 200 million years ago, Pangaea started to break apart. Pangaea was one large collection. North America and Eurasia separated from South America and Africa, and India, Antarctica, and Australia separated. And India headed up to run into Asia. Australia separated from Antarctica. South America and Africa split. North America and Eurasia split, forming the Atlantic Ocean. It's accurate because it was a single continental plate at the time.
It's quite accurate though. Europe and Asia.
Europe and Asia are one continental plate. They used to be separate. They were merged in the past, but a long time ago. What you define as continents gets to be a confusing mess and is heavily biased. But yes, Eurasia is probably a slightly more accurate way to refer to Europe and Asia as one unit. At least in the more, that is the technical term for Europe and Asia as one unit. 100 million years ago, North America and Eurasia have moved up. Africa and South America have separated. Antarctica and Australia are splitting. India is moving up. And then eventually we have North America, South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, Europe and Asia, India. Yeah. What we call continents is actually quite messy. And there's not a good, clear definition that matches what we actually use. But the thing that Wegener did is that he brought together a bunch of extra evidence, pieces of geologic evidence that supported his idea that everything used to be one continent that's separated apart. And there were three prominent lines of evidence that he highlighted. There was biological evidence, evidence of both currently living animals that matched on multiple continents, but also fossils that matched across continents, where it was like, how would these have traveled across the ocean if the ocean was still there? There was the continuity of geologic features, where certain geologic features seem to extend across continents. There's like mountain ranges and other things that crossed. And then there's evidence of past glaciers and the retreat of these glaciers that really only makes sense if the continents were in different positions. So what was covered by glaciers and also the way those glaciers retreated indicate the location. So the biggest piece of evidence that a lot of people talk about is the biological and paleontological evidence. So present day biological species on widely separated continents have similarities that suggest these land masses used to be together. Though it does turn out, with our more modern understanding, there's some surprising ways things can move. Better evidence is that there are identical fossil plants and animals that have been found on a number of continents. Once again, strongly suggesting that these continents were together when these organisms were alive. When you have a range that corresponds to where we find this, fossils of this animal, and it extends across two continents separated by an ocean, it doesn't really make sense for these animals to have been crossing the ocean. So here's an example. If we look at Gigantogeithis, that's the red area here. This is where we find fossils of it. They extend across South America in a strip, and then into Africa over here, where you can see how these would connect. Then we have Glossopisteris, which goes in to Africa, but it also goes into Antarctica and up into Australia and India. Mesosaurus goes from South America, the bottom of Africa, and into Antarctica. There are similar rock types in areas in South America and Africa, and North America and Europe, and there are matching mountain ranges. So the Appalachians in North America match up with the, I can't remember what these are called, but the North Atlantic Mountains in Europe. And then there's a similar set of mountain ranges, South America and Africa, but I don't actually mark on this map. So that's sort of the things that you can find that match up. Additionally, there's evidence of glacial retreat in South America, Africa, India, Australia, that indicate that all of these used to be further south and more close together. So if the continents of North America, Europe, South America, and Africa were all put back together, several geologic features become continuous, and this continuity becomes evident. So in the Northern Hemisphere, the Caledonian, Hebrides, Labrador, and Canadian Appalachians all match up. That's the sort of North European mountains and the Appalachians. In the Southern Hemisphere, the Cape and Sierra Mountains of South Africa and Brazil line up quite nicely. So here's a video about Wegener's discovery of continental drift.
Germany, 1911. A meteorologist named Alfred Wegener was browsing through some books when something caught his eye. A list of identical plant and animal fossils that had been found on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Wegener was intrigued. How could the same species have gotten from one part of the world to another? He examined the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa, and was struck how the shapes of the two coastlines might fit together. The more he looked, the more links he found. Species of land mammals in East Africa also inhabited the island of Madagascar. How did that happen? Did the animals evolve in both places at once? Or did they somehow cross from one land to the other, swimming hundreds of miles across the Indian Ocean? And then Wegener saw it all clearly. He realized that all the continents in the world had once formed a giant single landmass that he called Pangaea, from the Greek Pangaia, meaning all earth. It was in Pangaea that the plants and animals found on opposite sides of the world had once shared the same home. Then, over hundreds of millions of years, Pangaea had split apart, and its jigsaw pieces had drifted to their present locations. Wegener called his theory continental drift. Wegener wasn't the first scientist to speculate that the Earth had once been dominated by a supercontinent, but he was the first to pull together all the evidence and make a strong case for it. Unfortunately, his peers weren't very receptive. There was no mechanism to explain how the continents might plow through the oceans. Continental drift was just too incredible to believe. As a result, his discovery was largely ignored.
So yeah, so here's some continental features that are matched. Labrador and Hebrides, the Canadian Appalachians and Caledonian Mountains, the Sierra Mountains and the Cape Mountains all match up. And lastly, there's evidence for glaciers that existed 300 million years ago. The southern areas of South America, Africa, India, and Australia were covered with glaciers around 300 million years ago. There's no evidence of glaciation at this time in Europe and North America. These indicate that these areas, South America, Africa, India, and Australia, were much closer to a pole than while North America and Europe were further from the poles. Because if continents were at the same place they are now, if you had glaciers in South America, Africa, India, and Australia, you'd have glaciers in North America and Europe because they're closer to the poles. So it indicates that stuff had moved. Additionally, if we look at how those glaciers retreated, they match up with a Pangaea structure. So only when the continents are put into their Pangaea positions does this glacial episode make sense. And all these glacial areas were located close to the South Polar region around 300 million years ago. There's also some other evidence, like there's fossil deposits in North America and Europe that clearly hadn't been put down in like warmer climates, so they should have been more tropical, closer to the equator. That has to do with things like coal deposits and stuff like that. So there's some more evidence there. Though all this evidence supported his theory, it wasn't widely accepted at the time in the early 1900s. And the big problem was it had no mechanism to explain how the continents could move. He described them sort of crashing through oceanic crust, which didn't really make sense. So he couldn't, and no one else could, put together a mechanism that could explain how the continents could move through the oceanic crust. So there was sort of a lack of understanding of how the continents actually moved around. There was plenty of evidence that they had, but there wasn't any, and our understanding of how they actually moved wouldn't come until after World War II. Because it turns out the thing that needed to happen was that people needed to start mapping the bottom of the ocean. So after World War II, a lot more mapping and understanding of the ocean floor was done because we were fighting a war with submarines, and we wanted to know where all the things we might run our submarines into on the ocean floor were. So people started studying the ocean floor, and we found the ocean floor was a lot more complicated than they expected, things like that. So in 1960, Harry Hess was able to put together the evidence that had been discovered by various people, including this oceanic ridge system of strings of underwater volcanoes through the centers of all the oceans, this mid-ocean ridge system, and deep sea trenches that have been mapped in fair detail. Harry Hess put together this work by other scientists into a viable mechanism to explain continental drift. And he found the last and most important piece of evidence, which is paleomagnetic evidence. So the mid-ocean ridge system was known to stretch throughout the world. There were also known to be very deep, long and narrow trenches. Probably the most famous of these is the Marianas Trench, because it's the deepest ocean trench in the world, has the deepest point in the ocean, which is Challenger Deep. But there's a number of these trenches throughout. And there are also, in the middle of these oceans, there are these mid-ocean ridges, these sort of long strings of underwater volcanoes in the middles of oceans. So Hess proposed this theory of seafloor spreading, where at some places, the crust was separating apart, new material was welling up from below, from the mantle, creating new crust at these mid-ocean ridges. So plates slid away from mid-ocean ridges where new crust was created. And then at these ocean trenches, crust sinks underneath other plates and melts and is destroyed. So continents move kind of like on a conveyor belt, where at trenches, they're pulled and they're pushed away where new crust is formed at mid-ocean ridges. So new magma wells up and cools on each side of the mid-ocean ridge as the mid-ocean ridge slowly splits apart. And then at the other side, at these trenches, that is where one continental plate is sinking underneath another, and oceanic crust is being destroyed. So the entire ocean floor can be viewed as a giant conveyor belt where new sea floor moves away from the ridges and eventually descends back into the mantle of the trenches. So what he discovered is he was able to determine that the sea floor, all the sediment on the sea floor was very young. So like, if you look at the Atlantic Ocean, nothing in the Atlantic Ocean, seafloor sediments are more than about 180 million years old. And the deposits in the ocean get younger as you get closer to the trenches. And then the final kicker was there's paleomagnetic evidence that indicates the spreading at these trenches. So here's a short video about Hess's work at mid-ocean ridges, about how seafloor spreading works, and Hess's work at mid-ocean ridges.
Analyzing core samples and sonar readings from around the mid-Atlantic ridge, Hess made an astonishing discovery. a phenomenon almost beyond comprehension. The age of the Atlantic Ocean floor, he determined, was progressively older the further it moved away from the ridge. Harry Hess had discovered that the seafloor was spreading. He concluded that molten rock was being forced up from inside the Earth at the ridge, where it then formed into new crust on the ocean floor. Gradually, it was pushed away on either side as more molten rock continued pushing up from behind it. Hess called his great discovery seafloor spreading.
Harry Hess was in a position that he could bring it all together. Things were spreading apart and new Earth was being generated. But if you did this for long enough, the Earth should grow. And it doesn't.
The Earth doesn't get any bigger.
No. Harry appreciated the fact that if new Earth was being generated in one area, they have to be consumed or recycled in another area.
The process that recycles the crust of the spreading ocean floor back inside the Earth is called subduction.
And that's where one of these continental plates slides underneath another, sinks into the mantle, and melts. And the best and most convincing evidence of seafloor spreading, which provided a mechanism for continental drift, was paleomagnetics. So it turns out the magnetic field of the Earth changes over time. Every once in a while, it'll switch directions. What's a magnetic North Pole will flip and become a magnetic South Pole. And this gets recorded in rocks as they cool and form solid rock. So we can identify this in volcanoes as you drill down through layers of the volcano that have built up over time. So if there are magnetic minerals in the rock, those minerals get magnetized in the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. So if the Earth's magnetic field reverses, we can detect this. So as new magma wells up and cools, you get component minerals. One of the component minerals in the rock can be magnetite, which is Fe3O4. When this mineral crystallizes, when it cools, it becomes magnetized in the direction of the Earth's prevailing magnetic field, which is called remnant magnetism. This happens at volcanoes, but it also happens when new seafloor is created. And we know by looking at volcanoes that the Earth's magnetic field has frequently reversed over geologic time. Every million years or so, it'll flip. This is something that just happens. It has to do with the way that magnetic field is. We don't fully understand the processes, but it's due to the way that the magnetic field is generated in the liquid outer core that can become unstable and then end up reforming in the opposite direction. Now, if we look at the seafloor, we have evidence of remnant magnetism on the ocean crust. We see long, narrow, symmetric bands of magnetic anomalies on either side of any mid-ocean ridge, but the first one studied was the mid-Atlantic ridge. And these magnetic anomalies indicate the mid-Atlantic ridge has been continually spreading and the Earth's magnetic field has reversed itself many times. And the mid-ocean ridge spreading rates are in the range of a few centimeters per year. And you can actually see these patterns. If you look at them, they look, they have these repeating patterns where you have one magnetic property, then the other, then back and forth. They kind of look like zebra stripes or barcodes. And the kicker is that on both sides of the ridge, they're mirror images of each other. So if you run a magnetic sensor over the seafloor, you'll see on both sides of any mid-ocean ridge, the magnetic patterns are mirror images of each other, showing the spreading. Because the Earth's poles will reverse over time, and when you get new rock forming, it'll be magnetized in a different direction. And you can detect that by just running a magnetic sensor near the Earth's crust, because if the rock's magnetism is lined up with the Earth's magnetic field, you get a slightly stronger magnetic field. If it's opposed, you get a slightly weaker magnetic field. So The Earth's magnetic field does reverse every once in a while, and this can be recorded in the sea.
Hi, everyone. We're going to talk about the Earth's magnetic field and how the reversals in the Earth's magnetic field revealed that seafloor spreading is happening. The Earth's magnetic field creates lines of invisible force that you can't see, but that your compass needle senses. And the reason your needle points north is that these field lines emerge from the south magnetic pole and wrap around and point toward the north magnetic pole. Now, we know that the Earth's magnetic field has actually reversed, flipped around, so that these arrows would all point the other direction, coming out of the north and pointing into the south pole. And these are called magnetic reversals. They happen every few million years. The Earth's magnetic field flips back and forth through time. The reason we know this is that lava flows, like this lava flow on Hawaii, when lava flows out of the Earth, it actually, there's little magnetic minerals in the lava, and they line up with the magnetic field at the time and actually preserve, like a tape recorder, the direction of the Earth's magnetic field, whichever way it was pointing, either normal or reversed. So if we go look at a whole series of lava flows, what we'll find if we sample through the lava layers into older and older layers, we'll find some layers that are oriented with the magnetic field, say like today, and other layers, older layers that are reversed, and then still older layers that are like today. So through geologic time, the Earth's magnetic field flips back and forth, and we call these magnetic polarity reversals. Now, the way that this all relates to seafloor spreading can be realized by remembering that lava is pouring out of the Earth at mid-ocean ridges. Okay, so I want you to imagine that we're going to let this ocean basin spread, and we're going to let the Earth's magnetic field flip back and forth as the ocean basin spreads. Remember that when the lava erupts and cools down, it records the direction of the magnetic field at the time, whether it's normal or reversed, backwards or forwards. So we'll start the animation here. We're going to start it at a time when the Earth's magnetic field is like today, what we call normal polarity. And as the seafloor spreads, it's all going to get polarized in the direction of the magnetic field, shown by the blue part of the ocean floor. But now we have a reversal happening, and any new lava that erupts is going to get magnetized in the opposite direction. So you can see the little compass needles here have flipped, showing us that all this new seafloor is recording the direction of the Earth's magnetic field at a time when it was reversed. Now we'll let the Earth's polarity flip again. Any new lava that forms is going to record the polarity of the Earth at that time. So what we see on the mid-ocean ridges of the world today is a series of stripes, symmetrical stripes on both sides of the ridges of seafloor rock that's magnetized in the same direction as the magnetic field today, older rock that's reversed, still older rock that's back to normal. This pattern is impossible to explain if seafloor spreading didn't actually happen and the Earth's magnetic field didn't flip back and forth. So it constitutes some of the best evidence we have that the seafloor is actually spreading over geologic time.
So this model to explain how the continents actually move, the seafloor spreading, could be combined with Wegener's original evidence of biologic, paleontologic, geologic, and glacial evidence. That supported the theory of continental drift. Hess's theory and evidence, remnant magnetism, supports the idea of seafloor spreading. When these two ideas are combined, we now have a full theory explaining how the continents move, and that is our modern theory of plate tectonics. And that is the basis of modern geology, which means modern geology is surprisingly young. It didn't come about until about 60 years ago. So now we know that both oceanic and continental crust are carried as part of a thicker layer that's called the lithosphere. And we know that plates move. We can directly measure the movement of plates now with GPS and other methods. I mean, because it is on the scale of centimeters per year, but we can measure that now. We can measure accurately enough to measure the distance between 2 points on Earth that well. We can, and there are other things, we found lots of more evidence that supports this. There's also like magnetic evidence that helps us figure out where the continents used to be in the past, things like that. So we can now visualize ocean basins to be in a constant cycle with new crust being created at mid-ocean ridges and old crust descending at the ocean trenches. We know that the lithosphere is composed of a series of solid segments that are called plates. These plates are constantly moving and interacting with other plates. And the theory of plate tectonics encompasses all of these processes. And the lithosphere of the Earth is divided into about 20 plates. There's like 8 or so big ones, and then a bunch of smaller ones. So here's sort of that process by which new crust is created and old crust is recycled. So at a mid-ocean
It happens because hot rock rises, heated by the Earth's core. Near the surface, the rock spreads in 2 directions and goes sideways. It begins to lose heat. Eventually, the much cooler rock sinks back down. Through this spreading process, the Earth's crust is very slowly dragged apart. And it's this that ultimately causes the continents to move. Where the plates collide, the rock on the seafloor containing carbon from the dead plankton is carried deep into the Earth. As it descends, this layer of rock is heated, so the rock melts, releasing carbon dioxide. And gas is returned back into the atmosphere during an eruption. The remarkable cycle is complete.
So you can see that plates will sink into the asthenosphere. Lithospheric plates will sink into the asthenosphere where 2 plates collide, and crust will be destroyed. But you also get melting, which leads to things like volcanoes. So volcanoes tend to be at the boundaries between plates. You either get volcanoes, all those mid-ocean ridges where things are spreading apart. Molten rock rises up through the volcanic. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So there's sort of 2 ways you get strings of volcanoes. You get where the plates are spreading apart, you get long lines of the mid-ocean ridges are made of volcanoes, basically. It's a long string of volcanoes, like the volcanoes in Iceland. But also, when one plate goes under another, that plate will melt. That melting material will rise up, and you'll also get volcanoes. So here at the edge of the Pacific plate, where this is sinking under other plates, you get places like Japan. Japan was created by volcanoes from the seafloor forming new land, and the Philippines and much of the islands along the edge here. You can also have them sink under continents if you get volcanoes, so like the Andes Mountains in South America. That's where the Nazca plate is going under the South American plate. And the Cascade Mountains in North America, in the Pacific Northwest, that's where this small plate here, which I cannot remember the name of, is sinking under the North American plate. We're going to go into that in more detail later. But yes, that is how you get strings of mountains. But you can also get volcanoes in a way that doesn't involve the boundaries of plates. So you may have noticed Hawaii here is smack in the middle of a plate, nowhere near the edge of one. And that's because Hawaii is at a point where there's just an upwelling of hot magma, and it's a hot spot, and it forms volcanoes above it. But because the plate is moving, there's actually a whole line of volcanoes stretching out along Hawaii from where that hot spot used to be underneath the plate. And you can actually trace it back to all the way to Siberia, where it used to be millions of years ago. And there's other hotspots out there. Like Yellowstone National Park is a magma hotspot. There's one in India. You know. So the most active areas of the Earth's crust are along the boundaries between plates. Continental crust is primarily composed of silica-based minerals. That's minerals that consist primarily of silicon and oxygen, which gives it a lower density than oceanic crust. Oceanic crust is also made mostly of silicates, but it's silicates with much more magnesium and iron in them, so they're denser and heavier. So they're composed of magnesium and iron-rich basaltic rock, which gives it a higher density than continental crust. So, you know, oceanic crust is like 50% silicas, while continental crust is more like 75%. We'll talk about it later. The exact numbers. We have a lab about what kind of volcanic rocks, but there are three types of plate boundaries. You can have three possible interactions. The plates can either be moving apart, spreading apart, like at mid-ocean ridges. That's a divergent plate boundary. In the ocean, you get a mid-ocean ridge. On land, you get a rift valley. So the East African Rift Valley is caused by where East Africa is separating from the rest of Africa. You can have convergent plate boundaries where two plates are running into each other. Usually one plate gets consumed. There is an exception. We'll get to that. Either one plate gets consumed, or if they're both continental, they pile up and you get a mountain range. That's how you get the Himalayas. And then lastly, there are transform boundaries. So divergent is spreading apart, convergent is coming together, transform is sliding along side to side. Nothing gets created or destroyed, but you do get lots of earthquakes because it'll stick and release. And that's what's happening in California. The most famous transform boundary in the world is probably the San Andreas Fault in California. There's plenty of other ones out there, but that's probably the most famous one. So along the coast of California, through California, the Pacific Plate is moving north-ish, north-ish, and the North American Plate is moving relatively south-ish. So they're sliding along each other. Yes. It's surprisingly hard to make predictions for earthquakes so you can predict if you're likely to have an earthquake, kind of thing. But it's really hard to tell if you're going to have an earthquake, next week or this month in a short time scale. Short-term prediction of earthquakes is incredibly hard because it's like this slow buildup of tension until something snaps. And it's hard to tell exactly when something's going to snap, especially because we don't have good ways of observing that actual point of contact and stress. It's something people are working on. There's a whole bunch of techniques that people try, but it is really hard. Well, what people can do is they can detect the very first waves, things like that, and get very short-term indications. Like, you're about to have an earthquake in the next 5 minutes, but it can be here, get to safety kind of thing. But yeah, no, people are trying, but it's really hard. You can make predictions about whether you're likely to have an earthquake in a place by studying how often earthquakes happen there, and then sort of the rate. You basically assume that earthquakes happen at a sort of steady rate and whether you're overdue, but that's a probabilistic thing. So it's hard. You can do sort of long-term prediction, but short-term prediction is really hard and has not been successfully done very well. But definitely people are trying, but unfortunately they have not been very successful. Because there's a lot of people living in places where there are earthquakes, so people care. But in that very short term, sensing can actually be very helpful because you can use it to reduce the damage caused by earthquakes. So Japan, for example, has a bunch of systems designed to shut down things like water lines and gas lines when they detect the beginning of an earthquake, which massively reduces the damage caused by earthquakes because you're not releasing gas and water, which can increase the damage. So underlying the Earth's solid lithosphere is this higher temperature layer of the asthenosphere. This layer, though it's basically solid, is so close to its melting temperature that it's relatively plastic and it easily deforms. Sort of almost liquidy, and on longer time scales, it acts more like a liquid. And the asthenosphere is much more easily deformed than the lithosphere, and the lithosphere can be viewed as actually floating on top of the asthenosphere. That's a reasonably direct analogy. And because the lithosphere is floating on top of the asthenosphere, you get a concept of isostasy. Isostasy is the concept that the solid lithosphere floats in gravitational equilibrium. It's buoyant and it floats on the plastic asthenosphere. So, for example, continental plates will float higher on the asthenosphere because they're less dense than oceanic plates. So a larger portion of a continental plate will be sticking out. And at any given time, all the plates are in isostatic equilibrium, and mountain ranges represent thicker masses of continental material and therefore float higher. And you can actually, there's actually like very direct evidence of this. Places where material has been dramatically removed. So like the Hudson Bay area, where the glaciers retreated, so there's no longer all this massive glacier on top. It's actually slowly rising up because of that. It's floating up. Everything is slow because it's rock. So isostasy, it's like icebergs. 89% of the larger iceberg is submerged, while 89% of the smaller one is. And so you see a continental crust where you have tall mountains, you have a deep root. I think I'm going to stop there for now. So you do have a quiz in the SI session today. It should be reasonably straightforward. It's going to be the quizzes are mostly multiple choice, and they are curved. And I curved the whole class, so don't panic. So have a nice day, and I'll see you guys next week.